Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back. There's been a lot of talk right now, recently, especially on Twitter, about the minimum wage discourse and raising it back up to $15, which is sort of an arbitrary number. That started really, as far as I'm aware, with the Bernie Sanders Fight for 15 campaign, and that really became big, especially after the Occupy Wall Street movement, and has just sort of continued to be a sort of mainstay, especially in social democratic or leftist politics for a while now. So I wanted to make a real quick video just to share with you some of my thoughts on the $15 minimum wage. I'm not necessarily exactly for or against it, but I wanted to sort of share with you my kind of thought process when I'm thinking about these kinds of political issues, because personally I'm actually a little bit undecided on how I feel about it at the moment. So let's get right into it. So I think the first thing that we should ask whenever we're considering a new law or a new policy is what it actually really means. And one sort of shorthand phrase or way to think about it that I think is helpful whenever we're trying to do this comes from libertarian circles. Now, I personally am not a libertarian, but I do sympathize a lot with many libertarian ideas, and that tends to just be because of the way that they like to think about things, and also just their general orientation towards more freedom and against authoritarianism. So one of the things that's very popular for libertarians to say is, don't make a law that you're not willing to back up with the force of a gun. Now, that sounds a little bit extreme, but it's something that I think we should think about and really does need to be applied to every kind of law decision that we're thinking about making, because ultimately where every law leads is to that point. Now, it might sound a little bit extreme, a little bit overblown, but if you really think about it, if you think about what the meaning of a law is and what happens if you don't comply with that law, ultimately it will be enforced by some sort of agency of the federal government, or the government just generally, whether that's federal or state or local. But that will be enforced by police officers, and those police officers will show up with guns to enforce a law. Now, these particular law that you're talking about in any given instance may not be itself punishable with, for example, jail time. It may be punishable by a fine. It may be punishable by having certain licenses revoked and things like that. I'm sure that if you're a small business and you are, illegally not paying workers the minimum wage, they might demand that you get rid of those workers. They might charge you a fine. They might try to shut your business down. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if none of those tactics work, there will be some sort of officer at your door with a gun ready to either close down your business or take you off to jail, and there will be the full force of the law and everything that entails behind it. So that's something that we should just think about initially whenever we're considering a new kind of law and policy, whether or not this is worth backing up at the point of a gun. So the next stage, I think, is we should think about how this actually plays out in practice. So if you've got a workforce and you're paying them, let's say, $10 an hour, and you want to raise it up to 15, well, now you're paying everybody 50% more than they were getting previously. And of course, that gets multiplied by the number of workers you have. Now, this isn't necessarily going to be a huge problem for big companies, places like McDonald's, places like Walmart, places like Amazon. They have thousands or hundreds of thousands, or maybe even millions. I don't think they have millions, but maybe, of employees. And they can sort of move a lot of things around. They can move capital around. They can reallocate things. They can close down locations. They've got lots of different tools at their disposal and various kinds of things that they can do. Maybe they make some of their employees contract workers instead of full-time, in order to sort of get around these kinds of regulations. And of course, they also have usually large amounts of cash reserves on hand to sort of buffer whatever kinds of problems might come up in trying to make that transition. Whereas a smaller business, let's say a family-owned pizza shop, they've got, like, let's say, a mom and a dad, and they run the shop, and then maybe they employ their teenage son, and then maybe they employ some of his friends at the local high school. They're going to be in a much different situation under a new rise in the minimum wage law, because let's say they've got, let's say only 6 other employees besides the family members. And of course, the family members themselves have to be paid whatever the minimum wage is. Really, only the owner of the business doesn't have to be. So those employees, maybe they can afford to keep them at $10 an hour, but maybe they can't afford to keep them at 15. And so now you've got a problem. You've got a problem, which is that they might have to just simply let go of those employees. And, maybe they needed those employees in order to keep the shop open because they just don't have enough time between the 3 of them to, maintain all the operations. So maybe that means they have to downsize, or maybe even means they have to close the shop entirely because the value of the labor that they're getting from those people is simply not worth $15 an hour. And so when you're thinking about the implications of a law like this, you also have to think about what it means for the greater structure of the economy. And ultimately what it means is that there's going to be a higher barrier to entry for smaller businesses and smaller individuals to hire employees to do basic jobs under that kind of regime. And it means that you're going to need to have more capital, more resources at your disposal initially, and in general, higher cash flow in order to continue to operate, continue to keep employees around. And, that small business owner, maybe they wish they could pay their employees more. Maybe they're not trying to screw them over, as it's often presented in the sort of pro $15 case. It's always presented as like these are the evil businessmen and they just want to exploit their workers and they don't want to pay them enough to live off of. And so that's why they're not paying them so much. But oftentimes, especially with small businesses, that isn't the case at all. They care about their employees. They do things for their employees. They try to help them out. They know them personally. They have them over for dinner. But they simply can't, with the microeconomics of the situation, afford to pay them that much. And of course, a business like this also doesn't have the option of, let's say, just automating that job away or handing it off to some sort of machine. They don't have the kind of capital that they would need to make that kind of investment. So again, you're stuck with this dichotomy where the bigger businesses can adapt and change and they can sort of absorb that blow, whereas the smaller companies can't really. And so really what this does in this grand structure of the economy is you get more centralization, more consolidation, and fewer small, independent, family-owned businesses. And so that's something that we should think about as well, how this changes the structure of the economy, not just whether or not it's fair to the workers, but also whether or not it's fair to the producers and how that might change what gets produced and what's viable for a business model. Now, of course, there is a more humanitarian side to this. There's also the consideration for the workers. I think that, for example, there are a lot of workers who aren't making nearly enough. And someone who's only making $10 an hour, well, even if they're working full time, they're only working like, $30,000 a year. And that may not be enough in the future to be able to, really have a sufficient and dignified life that you can carve out of. It's going to be hard for them to start a family. It's going to be hard for them to get married. It's going to be very difficult to buy a house or even get out of, basic debt with that kind of an income. And so that is something that we need to consider as well, as how can we craft things in a way that does create broader amounts of prosperity. And I don't know if the changing the minimum wage and increasing it is the way to do that. It seems to me that there are good arguments to be made on either side of this. One other thing you should also consider whenever you're thinking about a law is how it's going to get implemented just on a policy level, because the minimum wage, at least in the United States, is not the same in every state as it is at the federal level, right? So when we're talking about raising the minimum wage, we need to be thinking about, are we raising it nationwide, or are we only raising it in the states? In most cases, the state minimum wage is actually already higher than the federal minimum wage. So in effect, the minimum wage is actually higher. It's higher in Michigan here than it is at the federal level. And so the federal government, may only require you to get paid, $7.50 an hour or whatever it is now. But in Michigan, it's been over that by several dollars for quite a while. And then the other thing, of course, is that it's going to have an uneven effect in different places. So, for example, the money that you're spending in Idaho is going to get you a lot further than the money that you're spending in California due to cost of living changes. And so maybe it doesn't make sense for Idaho and California to have the same minimum wage. And so in that case, a federal minimum wage might actually be very detrimental to the places where the minimum wage is lower out of necessity because the cost of living is simply not that high. Whereas in places like California and New York, where the minimum wage is already higher because of the fact that they have an increased cost of living, it may not be affected at all. In fact, increasing it may only bring it up to the level that they're currently at. And so that's the other angle too, is that you don't necessarily need to polarize one way or another to be for or against raising it. There's also questions of at what scale do you want to raise it. You could even, in theory, raise the minimum wage within a particular city. You could have a minimum wage in Detroit. You could have a minimum wage in Lansing, Michigan. You could have a minimum wage in Chicago. And of course, that would affect the structure, the economic structure of that city and how those resources get distributed and what kind of businesses are going to prosper there. And maybe people decide that they want to work, right outside the city in order to avoid having that, or maybe they decide that, hey, I want to get a job in that city because I'm a low skilled worker and I can make more that way. But these are the kind of factors that you have to consider whenever you're thinking about implementing a policy like this. Now, long term, I do think that there needs to be some sort of solution in order to have broader prosperity. The fact of the matter is, as the economy gets more and more complex, and as it gets more stratified, as it has, especially under the pandemic, things have gotten more centralized and more consolidated than they ever have been before. You're going to have basically a large amount of workers who are relatively low skilled, and due to either their lack of access to adequate education or training or just resources, or maybe they are lacking the cognitive ability, they're not going to necessarily be able to adjust in a way that brings in a high amount of income. They're not going to be able to have those high demand jobs. And they're going to probably, in all likelihood, be fewer of them in general. And so what we do with a lot of the people who may get left behind as the economy becomes more and more complex is a serious question. And I think that everybody should have a way to live a kind of dignified life and be able to afford to support themselves if they choose to do that, and potentially, buy a house, have a family. All of these things should be possible without you being a genius or without, having an exceptional amount of advantages. I think the median person should be able to do that reasonably well if they work hard. And so I'm not exactly sure what the solution to that is going to be long term. Maybe it'll be something like universal basic income. Maybe there'll be sort of a whole suite of government programs that sort of help out with very specific things, whether that's job training, whether that's jobs placement, whether that's giving incentives for people to be able to buy houses, to be able to start families, things like that. I think that, for example, getting more domestic manufacturing actually would help with that, because this nature of manufacturing businesses is that they have to have a lot of employees, whereas something like tech companies, for example, places like Google and Facebook, they're making billions and billions of dollars, but in terms of their valuation per capita of people employed, it's actually extremely high, because you can do a tech company with very few actual bodies compared to a more traditional company like a manufacturing company or a retail company. And so as more of the economy moves online and gets more digitized, the structure of companies and how many employees they need in order to operate is also going to change a lot. And that means that fewer companies are going to have large number of employees. It used to be that I think GM was the number one employer in the United States, and that was all based on manufacturing. And of course, they're no longer anymore. And that's going to have an effect on the way that our wealth is distributed. So those are just some considerations when you're thinking about what this minimum wage question means and how we should maybe approach raising it. I personally am still undecided. I can see from both sides how it might go. I'm fortunate enough that I've never been in a situation where I had to make the minimum wage, but I know that it's not necessarily going to be easy for the people that may be in that situation, and there needs to be some sort of solution long term. So let me know what you think. Put your comments in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time.